The cockpit shook with violent force. Warning lights flared across the control panel, each one screaming of danger. Smoke began to rise from beneath the dashboard. The plane had lost power in one of its engines. The crew's panicked voices echoed behind the closed door, and passengers cried out in terror as the cabin lurched violently. Amid the chaos, one man's hands remained steady on the controls. Captain Daniel Hayes knew at that moment this was no ordinary malfunction. This was life or death, and only one decision could keep them alive. The cabin roared with fear, but Daniel sat in silence, his face carved in grim determination. He didn't curse. He didn't panic. He simply held the yoke tighter, forcing the crippled plane to obey. His silence wasn't weakness, it was strength. Behind him, 200 souls depended on a man they could not see, a man who carried far more than just the weight of the aircraft. He carried scars the passengers would never know. The veteran-turned-pilot was no stranger to crisis. His shoulders bore invisible burdens, the weight of comrades lost in distant deserts, the sound of gunfire that still echoed in his dreams, the sting of decisions that had no right answer. Daniel had learned long ago that fear could scream, but courage whispered, and in moments like these, silence spoke the loudest. Long before he sat in this cockpit, Daniel Hayes was a boy who loved the endless sky. Growing up near a small military base, he watched fighter jets streak across the horizon, their roar filling his chest with wonder. His father, a mechanic who worked on those very planes, often carried the smell of oil and jet fuel home on his clothes. It was the scent of possibility, of dreams stitched into the fabric of service. When Daniel was 18, he left for the Air Force, his heart swelling with pride as he wore the uniform for the first time. He served through nights of sandstorms and days of blistering heat. He learned to fly under fire, to land on runways lit only by burning wreckage, to guide his crew through the unthinkable. He saved lives, but not always all of them. He carried names of brothers and sisters he could not bring home. After decades of service, he sought the quiet skies of civilian life. He became a pilot for a commercial airline, hoping that carrying families to reunions, children to vacations, and soldiers home from deployment might offer a gentler kind of purpose. Yet he knew he would always be called to stand in the gap between life and death. As the plane trembled over the ocean, Daniel's co-pilot, a younger man named Lewis, glanced at him with wide eyes. Lewis's voice cracked as he read the instruments. "Engine 2's gone, Captain. Hydraulics are dropping. We won't make land." Daniel said nothing. His jaw tightened. His fingers adjusted the throttle, his mind already 3 steps ahead. He didn't need to shout. Panic wasted time. Calm saved lives. His silence was the anchor holding the cockpit together. Behind the locked door, passengers were left to their imaginations. Some whispered frantic prayers. Others clutched strangers' hands as though they had known them forever. Flight attendants moved down the aisle, trying to mask their fear with trembling smiles. And in the midst of it all, a child's voice rose above the terror. "Mom, are we going to die?" That question pierced through the fuselage like a blade. It wasn't directed at Daniel, but it landed in his chest with crushing weight. No one would ever understand what it meant to sit in that seat, to know that hundreds of lives balanced on your decisions. Daniel could have walked away from this life after the military, choosing safety, choosing comfort. But he had chosen instead to bear the burden once more. Courage isn't the absence of fear. Courage is carrying fear into the fire and refusing to let it decide for you. Lewis looked at him again. "We have minutes, Captain. If we try to land on water, we might flip. If we try for land, we might not make it." Daniel's eyes locked on the horizon. Somewhere beyond the haze, he spotted a strip of coastline. It wasn't a runway. It was rough, uneven ground, but it was hope. The plane lurched again, harder this time. Luggage spilled from the compartments. A woman screamed. The crew braced against the walls, and in that chaos, Daniel made his choice. He turned to Lewis, his voice steady for the first time since the crisis began. "Get them ready. Brace positions. Tell them we're going home." Lewis hesitated, understanding the unspoken meaning in those words. Daniel would not leave the cockpit. He would not abandon the controls. This landing would demand a sacrifice. The co-pilot's throat tightened, but he nodded and left to prepare the cabin. Daniel was alone now. Alone with the storm of alarms, the acrid smell of burning wires, the cold sweat dripping down his neck. Alone but not afraid. He whispered to himself words no one else would hear. If I can keep them safe, it's enough. In the cabin, Lewis relayed the captain's orders. Panic shifted into trembling resolve as passengers bent forward, pressing their heads against their knees. Mothers held children close. Elderly passengers closed their eyes, clutching their rosaries. But no one knew the full truth, that the man guiding their descent had already made peace with his fate. Sacrifice has no audience. It is not loud. It does not boast. True sacrifice is silent, unseen, and absolute. The coastline loomed closer. Daniel adjusted the flaps, his arms straining against the failing hydraulics. The ground rushed upward, unforgiving and fast. For a moment, he thought of his daughter's smile, of his wife's laugh, of the quiet mornings he would never see again. And then he thought of the passengers, 200 strangers who trusted him without knowing his name. And he whispered a final line that lived only in the cockpit. Courage is not living without fear. Courage is giving everything, even when fear tries to stop you. The landing was violent. The fuselage groaned, metal screamed, and fire sparked along the left wing. The cabin filled with cries and gasps as the plane skidded, bounced, and finally came to a grinding halt against the earth. For a long, terrible second, there was only silence. Then life. People began to move, stumbling out of their seats, rushing toward the exits. Flight attendants guided them, pulling terrified children into their arms, steadying trembling hands. Smoke billowed, but the passengers poured out into the open air, one after another. Every single one survived. Every single one, except Daniel Hayes. When rescue crews arrived, they found him still strapped into his seat, hands locked around the controls. He had held the yoke to the very end, ensuring the nose never dipped, ensuring the tail never split. He had chosen the seat of sacrifice so others could stand in the sun again. As survivors gathered outside, many wept. Some fell to their knees. Others simply stood in stunned silence. They didn't know his story, his battles, his scars. But they knew this. A man they had never truly met had given them the greatest gift of all: life. News spread quickly. Headlines carried his name across the world. Airports fell silent in moments of respect. Families who would have been broken apart were instead reunited, holding one another tighter because of him. And slowly, people began to speak the words that would outlive the moment. True courage means sacrifice. At his funeral, hundreds gathered in silent tribute. Pilots in uniform lined the runway, standing at attention. Former soldiers who had once flown beside him raised their hands in salute. Survivors of the crash held flowers, tears streaming as they whispered thank yous into the wind. And as the casket was carried toward the horizon, a formation of planes streaked across the sky, leaving trails of white against the blue. The crowd stood in silence, their hearts heavy, their pride unshakable. It was not victory born of power, but of sacrifice. A sacrifice that turned tragedy into testimony. And so the story of Captain Daniel Hayes reminds us all: true courage is not measured by medals, applause, or recognition. True courage is the quiet choice to give, to protect, to sacrifice, even when no one is watching. In a world where words are loud and pride is louder, let us remember the silent heroes, the ones who carry the weight for us, the ones who remind us that dignity does not shout, it whispers. If you are watching this now, take a moment to reflect. Would you have had the strength to do what he did? Where are you watching from? Share your thoughts below and honor his story by keeping it alive. For more stories that shine light on silent heroes, subscribe and join us in remembering those who choose courage, even when it costs everything. Because sometimes The greatest lives are not the loudest. They are the ones who speak through sacrifice.